Hi, it's Sandra from SandraD Imagery, and this Watch Me Edit video is where I'm going to show you how I created this image, my thought process, and where I got the inspiration or idea from. This is the finished image, and it's certainly different in colour to when I first started. And I started with a texture as the base, and then I added my elements. Now, where did the inspiration come from? Was I had seen an image somewhere in a magazine and I thought, oh, I love that. Let's have a look at the elements to see what they used and what could I use with the elements or the photos that I have. So I tucked that idea away in the brain cells, just waiting for that moment to create an image, something that was based on a similar image that I saw, but adding my own style. Let's dive in and show how I created that image. This is my first layer that I started with, a fine art or a digital texture from my shop, and the colour is called Cornflower and it's from one of my textured collections. Now I chose this blue colour purposely because I knew that I was going to use the next element and I wanted to give a contrast in colour. But you're going to see as I go through my layers later on that the colour certainly changed. But this base layer gave the depth of colour that worked when I started to do some other techniques in the image. So my next layer that I wanted to do was add in the sky. And then that gives an illusion of just nice little clouds coming through as there is a sky there. Let's click on that layer. The blend mode is soft light and the opacity is at 100%. If I change the blend mode to normal, that's actually what it looks like. But I'll come back, turn on soft light, and you can see that just adds beautiful clouds peeking through. The next layer is really what was the hero, and this gave me the idea to create the image. I'll turn the layer on, and it's a lotus lily that I photographed somewhere in my travels, and I cut it out and put it away into the stock library, just ready to be used for when I have an idea. And so there it was, the beautiful lotus lily. But I can actually see there's a mismatch in the lighting. If you look at the background and the texture that I chose, it's quite muted in its colour palette. The clouds are soft, yet the lotus lily is quite contrasty and quite bright because I photographed it in the daytime. Now I knew that if I was going to play with this lily to try and dull the light down, I might lose a little bit of detail. I didn't know what to do. So what do you do when you're not sure what to do? Is experiment, and that's what I did. I duplicated the layer. And let's turn that layer on. And now by having two layers with the lily, you can see it's given it some depth. Now there still is a mismatch in the light, but what I've got is some depth, and I've got some beautiful pink coming through that was very subtle in the first lily. Let's turn this layer off and have a look, because that looks quite translucent. By duplicating the layer, it gave it some depth. Now, as I said, I experimented, an idea came in the head and I thought, why not? So now I've got my hero, the lotus flower in there, or lily. Now I want to build up the elements. So the next layer, I had a graphic or digital art, and you can see it's a boat. Now what I'm going to do is just double click onto this layer, and because it's a smart object, I'm able to do this. I'll double click, and there's the digital art. I got that somewhere in my, I think, travels of buying different things, and I kept it there. Now I love the boat shape, but I didn't want the lantern. So what I did, we'll come back and have a look, is that I actually created a mask, and I masked out or brushed out that lantern that was there. Now my next layer is where I wanted to put strings or rope, like coming down from a hot air balloon, and I didn't have any in my stock library at that time, but I knew I had a graphic or digital art of a hot air balloon that I could use, brush out some of the balloon and the basket and use that as the rope. What I am going to do is show you how the balloon looked. I'll just disable this mask, and there you can see the actual balloon. It was a graphic element that I had, and it was my workaround fix to get the ropes and the strings that I wanted to give the illusion of this hot air balloon. But what I have done is brushed away or masked away the elements of that balloon that I didn't want in my image. I'll enable that mask back on, and there you can see that's where I got those ropes attached to the boat to give it an illusion of actually strings attached or ropes. I'll go and click onto that layer of the balloon and just have a look. The blend mode is multiply. Now I'll turn that to normal on the blend mode, and you'll see that the ropes look very pale. So again, it was a workaround. I tried different blend modes, and I found by using multiply, it just gave that little bit of darkness, but without being too strong or too dominant. Then what I've added is the man and the actual magnifying glass, and then I've added the sky underneath. Let's turn those layers off and let's have a look. There's my first element. I put in the man in the boat. It's a graphic element that I've added, digital art. And I looked at it and I thought, well, it just looks like he's standing in a boat. Nothing spectacular about that. What can I do? So I went into my stock library and had a look at the things and photos and images that I've got, and I found one of a magnifying glass. I'll turn that layer on and I'll just show you that it looks like he's standing there behind this magnifying glass looking out. Now, why did I choose that element? I just experimented with some different elements that I have in my stock library. As soon as I put that on, I went, oh, I quite like that. So I've left it there. Now what I wanted to do was give the illusion that this hot air balloon is floating in the sky. And I added one of my textures in there. And it's the sky textures that's in the collection. I'm going to disable the mask, and you can see that's the actual sky texture. Again, I've brushed or masked out the elements of this sky that I didn't want. I'll put the mask back on and we'll show you. So now I have a look and go, oh, I quite like that. But what else can I add to this? And I thought, and I went, well, what can I add? Again, I went into my stock library, and I have these that are digital art, and I put my first fish in, and I looked at it and I went, that's it, love it, going to leave it in there. This image is not about being real. Then I thought it looked a bit unbalanced, and I put another fish in just underneath, made it smaller using the transform tool. What is the transform tool? It's one of those tools or techniques that you use to size an element or reposition, and the shortcut key on the keyboard is Control-T, and I'll just put the transform tool on this fish here, and let's get that transform tool happening, and there it is. Now what I can do is I can size this fish, can make it bigger, smaller, I can move it around. There's a number of things and techniques that you can do using the transform tool. There's a free tutorial on my website, SandraD Imagery, that's got a number of Photoshop tutorials, and one of them is how to use the transform tool. So I'll just untick that because I want that fish to be where he is, because I'm happy with it. Now I look at the image and I go, I've got the elements in. I'm sort of happy with the colour. So the next technique that I use to soften the colour is what I call Photoshop brushes, either watercolour or in Impressionism, and I paint over that to give it a painterly look. I'll turn that layer on, off. It's one of the techniques that I use that when I want to soften my colours a little bit and make it a bit more painterly. And there's many techniques, as I said, that you can do this, and this is just one that I like in my workflow. Next I look at it and I go, I'm happy with it, but it's a bit too contrasty. Again, I can see the mismatch in the light from the lily to the background. So one of the techniques that I use is I use a hue and saturation level and I desaturate it. I'll turn that layer on and off, and you can see now it's stripped a bit of the colour out. That's my technical term for it. But I quite like it because it's soft. But now I look at it and I go, the texture that I chose as the base was blue, but this is looking a bit too bluey. And it's not allowing the heroes to pop out from that background. What can I do? So, again, I experiment. I went and tried some different textures, and I chose this texture. I'll turn that on and I'll talk about why I chose the texture, and I'll show you the colour. So now it's gone from blue to a real green base, but you can see that blue that's coming through. So what I'm going to do is let's have a look at the blend mode first. Soft light and 88%. Let's go to normal blend mode and change that opacity to 100%. And you can see this texture's got some nice grungy texture, but it's green. It's got some depth rusty colour, so it's quite warm, but it acts as a balance to that blue colour underneath. I'll turn that back to soft light and I'll explain what I mean by that. Just get it back to roughly around about the 89%. So when I look at the blue base, I'll turn that layer off. I don't want to go for another blue. I don't want to go for a fine art or a digital texture that's light in colour. And I don't want something that's too strong in the texture itself or too grungy, because I want the heroes to shine through. So if you think about colour theory, what's the opposite to cool is warm, and that's why I chose that texture. Now, to be honest, it was a fluke. I just went in, tried different textures. As soon as I used this one, it's called Sheraton Sage from one of my texture collections in my shop, and I went, that's it. It's now got the depth that I'm after, and I'm happy with the colour, and colour's really important to me. Now I scan the image and I look at it and I go, is there anything missing? Is there anything that I can add? And I thought, well, there's a boat. What do you normally have on a boat? A steering wheel. Went into the stock library and found this element. I'll zoom in and you can see there it is. It's just a digital art cogwheel, I think it was. I'll click on that layer. I've actually chosen the blend mode darker colour and the opacity at 79 because I wanted to make the tones of this wheel blend in with that magnifying glass. If I turn that blend mode off and I drop the opacity or take the opacity back up to 100%, it's quite contrasty compared to the metal that's on that object. And so what I wanted to do was to soften that. And so I used the blend modes to actually change that. So we'll go back in and choose, well, let's go and get overlay. Let's experiment here. Soft light. No, I don't like that because that's too soft. It's letting it through. Let's try vivid light. No, that's too dark. Why I'm doing this is what I do. I experiment, with the blend modes, the opacity, and actually see what I can do. I'll go with darken, and we'll leave the opacity at 100% just for this. The next layer, I've done one of my techniques that I use quite a lot in my composite images, and it's called color toning. Again, there's a Photoshop tutorial on my website, SandraD Imagery, that will show you how you can use that technique. I'll just turn that layer on, and I use that just to blend the color in with the background, one of the techniques that I use. My next layer is the stamp visible layer, because I want to now add a little bit of color and use a preset or a tint that I have in my toolbox of tools to use. I'll turn that layer on. It's very subtle. I'll just come that right down. I'll turn that layer off and on, and you really can't see it because all I'm doing is brushing in the contrast into certain areas. Have a look at the mask here, and you can see it's a black mask, so I've inverted the mask and I've actually brushed in where I want some contrast. It's a little technique, it's subtle. Let's have a look and see if you can pick it up. It is actually on the lotus, very subtle indeed. Now I look at my image and I think there's an imbalance. I don't know what it is, but you've got the element, the hot air balloon, you've got the fish that adds the balance down there, but there's nothing up here because that sky now is just sort of fading into the background, which I like. So I added in a moon, and there I get the balance now of what I want. With all my elements in place now, I'm happy with the composition of the composite. I like the color. I like the simple design. I'm going to add a tint or a preset. I'll turn that on. Now you can see it just gives it a little bit of a lift and it adds in some warm tones. So these tints or presets is I've created them over the years. It's like a recipe, and I've saved it as an action, and I'll use that in my workflow. Another stamp visible layer. Finishing touch, I add a levels to give it a little bit more of a contrast, or punch, a bit too contrasty. I've desaturated, using a hue and saturation. Now the next layer is what I call a color dodge technique. And so what I'm wanting to do is brush in some color and using like what they call a color dodge. I'll turn this layer on. It's a blank layer, and what I've done is just sampled a color, the pink, and I've brushed over it, and from memory the opacity for this when I was brushing it in was roughly around about the 10%. I'll turn that layer off and on. So now I get some subtle depth of color, but also a softening of the pink. Let's have a look again. I'll turn that layer off and on. And there's my final layer. This image all started where I saw an image in a magazine that I liked. I looked at the elements and thought, well, they've used a flower. What have I got in my stock library? That's why I looked and found the lotus lily. But then I added my own style with the elements, the colouring, and it was fun. But it was also a good learning curve in some things because I had to get a workaround. If something didn't work, for example, remember I doubled up the layers of the lily to give it a bit more depth. I started with the blue texture base, which I thought was the right colour to choose, but it didn't work out once I started to add the elements. So I added another texture that was a contrast or the opposite to the blue, which is like the green and the yellow in that texture, which gives it warmth. And there's my finished image. It was fun, and you can have fun creating images too.